Verso for setting up this fantastic panel. I feel like it's really great that we were able to bring in David and Tyler from out of town, two people whose work I've followed for some time. So we're, myself, David, and Tyler are going to talk a little bit about our conceptualizations around abolition, and Tag and Yasmina are going to sort of respond to that, talk about their own work a little bit, a little free form, bear with us, but we should have plenty of time for some back and forth. So I'm assuming that this is an audience that doesn't need the ABCs of why policing is a problem. You know, I give a lot of talks in bookstores and academic settings where I feel like I got to start with the, you know, police shouldn't kill so many people, we shouldn't use police for everything that we use them for. But I thought for this audience and for this panel, I would just talk a little bit about my own conceptualization of abolition and what that means to me, and how I've treated it in the book, and some of what I think are the strengths and limitations of that. And if anyone needs to know why the war on drugs is bad, we can talk about that in the Q&A. The conceptualization for this book actually was pretty well fleshed out before Ferguson, before Eric Garner was killed. Andy, who was here earlier from Verso, and I had pretty much, you know, inked the deal and planned it out. And I was a little skeptical about, you know, how big an audience there would be for it. At that time, this was now almost 5 years ago, there was a literature about prison abolition. And I was trying to build on that literature, and I'm a police scholar, and I've worked on policing issues for decades, and I had long felt that the focus on prisons really failed to take into account not only the fact that policing is the front door of that system, but also the impacts that policing have on individuals and communities that never result in incarcerations. And this can be a huge impact. And in fact, at that time, 5 years ago, we were coming out of the stop and frisk mania, where we had hundreds of thousands of these coercive, punitive, and sometimes violent and degrading interactions between the police and the public that almost never resulted in anyone getting arrested, and even less often resulted in someone going to prison. And so the prison abolition literature never really dealt with that. So this got me to think about, well, what would an abolitionist approach to policing look like? And the basic orientation I've taken to the whole thing is kind of, it's process-oriented, which is to say, I've tried to take the stance that there are problems in communities. Communities have drug problems. Not all drug use equals drug problems, but there are drug problems. There are harms associated with drugs. There are youth violence problems. There are problems of mass homelessness, et cetera. But that, why is it that we've come to view punitive and coercive state power as the only possible solution to these problems? So rather than starting from the position of imagine a world without police, I tried to start from a position of show me the problems that you have, and let's try to figure out non-coercive, non-punitive solutions to those problems. And if there's something left at the end of that process that we can't figure out any other way to deal with it than to have some kind of coercive approach, I don't know, armed bank robbers maybe, or large-scale collective racist violence or something, you know, maybe there's something. I'm not committed to either of those, but I'm like, if there's something like that that we can't figure out, then so be it, let's keep working on that. But the reality is, for the vast majority of what police do today, there are alternatives. And I think as someone who spent a lot of years riding around with cops, watching what cops do day in and day out, I really had this very profound sense that it almost never involves armed bank robbers or large-scale collective violence or, you know, truly dangerous predators for which there's no other possible response. When you go on patrol with police, even the police themselves will joke it's 99% boredom and 1% sheer terror, and I always say, and even that's really an exaggeration. Because for most police officers, they make maybe one felony arrest a year. When a uniformed patrol officer makes a felony arrest, they're like cop of the month. It's a big deal. But we have this totally skewed idea from television that they're out there chasing, you know, serial murderers and rapists and bank robbers all day, when in fact they almost never have anything to do with those kinds of crimes. So what I've tried to do is lay out solutions to community problems that have a kind of beginning, middle, and end stage. There are things that we could do right now within the existing political and economic arrangements that don't require massive changes. And we know this in part because examples exist in the US and in other places. For instance, we could have restorative justice programs in schools instead of thousands of school police. We could have community-based anti-violence initiatives, the so-called cure violence approaches, because we have them in some places and the results are often very good. But then there are bigger elements to all of these problems that prevent them from being able to be completely solved just by these entry-level solutions. You know, restorative justice can't solve all the problems that young people bring into school from outside. And community-based anti-violence programs can't solve profound inequalities in job markets, segregation in housing, you know, broad disinvestments in communities. So we've got to also articulate those bigger picture solutions as well. So there's a real sense in which the kind of program that I end up laying out, you know, a strength and a weakness of it is that in a way it's not really inconsistent with a kind of DSA analysis worldview of a kind of more robust social welfare state that's more responsive democratically. So in that sense, it doesn't require kind of the overthrow of capitalism. Because one of the discourses around abolition has been that can we really achieve abolition in the context of a liberal capitalist democracy? And I sort of soft pedal that in the book by instead laying out these process-oriented approaches. But my feeling is that if we lay out a logic of handling problems in ways that empower communities and build up individuals, what we're doing is we're highlighting the contradictions of liberal capitalist democracy because it's unable to actually do those things. And if we start with the things that maybe are achievable, but we keep pressing on the bigger picture items, then we make those contradictions clear, we make the ethical imperative of our position clear, and we set the framework for additional organizing, additional kind of maximalist demands, and hopefully, you know, broader forms of empowerment. And I've been extremely pleased with the kind of reception that the book has received. When I go and give public events, I expected a lot of people would start with, what do you mean no police? What does that mean? Instead, the response has been, how do we do it? We don't need to be convinced. We know that that policing is messed up. We know that these reforms aren't working. We know there are alternatives, but we don't know how to get there. We don't know what the process would look like. And I kind of wish I had written more about process in the book. Maybe that's the next book for someone else to write. But what I've been saying about process has been really focused on grassroots organizing. I was invited to come to Ferguson by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and the Advancement Project and meet with the activists there who'd spent 4 years trying to do reform and who felt like they were getting nowhere. And I said, instead of spending all your time at police commission meetings, pick a local ward leader, city council member, district, identify some problems that aren't being addressed positively but are only being addressed by police, and start organizing town hall meetings to articulate non-police solutions to those things and to say, why can't we have this? Why are we still sending police to deal with low-level drug issues? Why are we still sending police to deal with mental health issues? Why can't we have drug treatment on demand? Why can't we have safe injection facilities? Why can't we have some kind of mental health infrastructure? And I really think there's no shortcut to that kind of neighborhood-level grassroots organizing. And so I've been trying to support that kind of work wherever I go. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Alex. I'm David. Thanks, Anne and Verso, for having us here. I'm not checking my phone. I have notes there, actually. I too, like Alex, I've given some talks in front of folks who, are not interested in police abolition. But most of the groups I've talked to are interested in police reform in one way or the other. The origins of this book, for me at least, are in 2014. I had been writing about police violence in Albuquerque for years before 2014, and just a few months before police killed Mike Brown in Ferguson, Albuquerque police killed James Boyd in Albuquerque. This was in March of 2014. And Albuquerque, like a lot of cities in 2014, early 2015, erupted in a lot of anger and protest. And so, I was writing about, I was trying to, what I saw my role at the time being was someone writing in local press, sort of warning people about the pitfalls of reform. Albuquerque is like a lot of cities in the United States. It's highly segregated by race, and has a long history of police violence. And I realized pretty quickly that these sort of facts on the ground didn't really dissuade folks from believing in their hearts that police reform could fix it. And I could say, and this is true, that in 2014, the Albuquerque Police Department committed 21% of all the homicides in the city of Albuquerque. And I would remind people that between 1987 and 1997, the police killed more people per capita in Albuquerque than any other city in the United States. And then that created an uproar in 97 that produced all these reform measures, like a new and greatly expanded police oversight commission and higher standards for training and changes in the way that new police were recruited. And then they promptly killed more people over the next 5 years in terms of pace, right? And partly what I was trying to do at the time was, and really the worst day to me was the day the Department of Justice issued their findings letter in April of 2014, which was an incredibly tough letter. All these letters that the DOJ writes when they do these investigations, which they don't do anymore, obviously, under Trump, are tough letters. But it was a feeling in Albuquerque, and I could see it even among activists who've been working on the ground for a long time, that, well, finally, something's really going to happen here. And, and I think and my fear was that it would, this sort of the narrative of reform and the language of police reform would co-opt and hijack the energy of so many people who, finally, I think, really recognized what was going on. There were some people, of course, that know exactly what's going on and always have and have never believed for a minute that police reform was going to solve anything. But there were, I was at a meeting one time, this very wealthy, like religious leaders, white guy, he got up and said, when I drive home from church in my Prius, I really fear for my safety. I was like, no, you have nothing to worry about. But there was this moment when, people were seized with this fear that something's really wrong here. But it was a fear that was so easily captured. I mean, by some people, so the sort of larger movement that was developing, so much of it, and largely it was sort of a white, economically comfortable segment of that group, who had once been outraged and now were satisfied that these new reforms that the Department of Justice were offering and these promises from the police department and City Hall were really going to finally do something. And of course, it hasn't done anything in Albuquerque whatsoever, hasn't changed really anything. And it got me to thinking at the time, well, what is it about reform that's so compelling? Like, what is it about police reform that, despite all evidence to the contrary, despite whatever empirical evidence we want to marshal, we can find it to demonstrate that it doesn't actually work, that it doesn't solve the problem we're after, and yet it is so compelling. There's a lot of reasons, but one of the things that struck me was the way in which the language of police reform captures the imagination, or really maybe I should say this better, forecloses sort of an abolitionist imagination. And, it became clear to me that, police don't just patrol our streets, but they patrol the language we have to talk about them. Everything we know about police, the way we talk about police, comes to us in an idiom delivered by police. And so in one way or another, there's always a cop in our head that we're fighting against or submitting to. And, there's a few reasons for this. I mean, one is the obvious one that I think Alex was getting at when he was in his remarks, which is that the police do everything, and there's no alternative to police. We have all these problems, and police are the answer to this, right? I mean, that's a really pervasive idea that police is the solution. Who am I going to call if not police? Despite the fact that they never help when you call them. They very rarely help, I should say that. The other idea that makes it so compelling is this idea of perfectibility, right? Like police are always on a path to perfectibility. And it's through ideas like the bad apple cop and those types of things that we give a pass, or not, I'm saying the collective we gives a pass when problems come up. It's like, wow, we're going to fix that. This reform is going to fix that. Police are bad now, but they're going to be better soon, right? They're always on this path to perfectibility. And then lastly, the only language we have to talk about police, as I said, comes to us from police. And so, Tyler and I began to think about a way to interrupt that. How would we do that? And I have to say, when I was first, working on the ground in Albuquerque with activists and writing sort of popularly, I really resisted the idea of writing a book at all about police, because my thought was, we don't lack critical, radical texts about the problem of police violence. We don't have that problem. There's plenty. Alex has been writing a long time, and so many other activists in so many disciplines and scholars, that we don't lack for that. So the facts don't matter. It's not, I thought to myself, we can't overcome this sort of logic and language of police reform through just marshaling evidence, right? Because evidence doesn't matter to people who support the police or support the idea of reform, right? Because that's the past. And police are on this path to perfectibility, so let's let this work out. Let's hope that reform works. And so my thought was, well, wouldn't a book be helpful then that takes the language that we use to talk about police, this language, all the concepts and terms we have about police, terms like rough ride or curfew or lynching or nightstick or security, red squads, patrol, the beat, pursuit. All these terms or concepts that in one way or another seem so self-evident because they come to us fully formed in the police imagination. And they're available to us only in the police imagination. And I've been in meetings, and you probably have too, where these words come in. People are using these words, right? I'm like, you realize, you're talking about justified. You're using words like armed and justified in a register that cops would use it, and that forecloses us challenging the way that police organize the work they do, and the way reformists rely on our faith in the police project writ larger than the one in front of us, which is someone lying dead on a sidewalk. And this to me was really a pressing issue. I thought we need this. Originally the title we offered was Police, a Counter Glossary, and it was Verso's idea to have it much more mundane so that it would trick people into reading it. So they wouldn't know they were reading this radical text. But the point of the book is to try to offer up all these concepts and terms, and there's about 100 in the book, and pull back the curtain to say, now listen, when cops say justified, this is what they mean, right? When cops talk about pursuit or crowd, right, or this is what we're really talking about. And the point here is to try to help us not just interrupt this logic, this police logic that makes this thing called police reform so persuasive, but also to make some space for a more radical language that we could share in confronting the problem of police violence. Because if we don't do that, then the real risk, in my view, of police reform is not that it forever forecloses on any abolitionist dreams, but it actually enlists us in the police project. Like lapel camera is one example. The lapel camera is this sort of this sort of prize of a lot of sort of libertarian activists. And to me, all it does is makes us see the world like cops. We're not stopping police violence. We're not confronting police violence. We're just watching the shit happen from the vantage point of the cop. And in a sort of in a police world, we're always potential threats. Everything is always a potential emergency. And only the cop has the discretion to figure out which is and which isn't. And so, to organize, but this is a trick. I mean, I was in Seattle last week. Alex was there as well, and we were giving a talk, and there were a lot of activists doing really amazing work, and they really, a few of them were really frustrated with this sort of the way that I at least was talking about this, because they're doing really important work, and it's absolutely reformist in nature, and they know it. Right? But they're trying to figure, and my argument was, I was working with families of people whose family members have been killed by the police in Albuquerque, and the goal always was, let's stop that next person from getting killed, but let's not forget the larger goal, right? We're not gonna buy the sort of idea that we fixed police because we fired a few cops, or because we publicized a few issues the cops didn't want us to publicize. But we have to do that nevertheless. So the point of the book is not to say, well, any effort that at all is involved in police reform or participates in any police reform process is automatically corrupt. Rather, it's to say we have to think about reformist reform versus non-reformist reform. Any reform that sort of robs the police of power, robs the police of the ability to do what cops think their job is a good measure, and we should support it. But there has to be these sort of, like any abolitionist dream, I'm really convinced, has to take the language of policing seriously. And we need to construct a language that doesn't come to us from cops. And until we can do that, at least this is my thought in the book, until we can do that, we're like in Albuquerque, we're gonna have these Pyrrhic victories, and then watch other people dying, and have, as Steve Gomez, whose son was killed by police, said, and then some other family is going to join a club they don't ever want to be a part of, right? So thank you. I'll turn it over to Tyler.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for putting this on, Ann and Verso. I think what I'll do with my comments, Alex and David have both kind of talked about the compelling ways in which reform kind of can co-opt more maybe radical approaches to police, but is to pause and think a little bit about police itself and the idea of police, which I think I would agree with David that there's all kinds of books and histories that we know about the problems of policing and racist state violence through policing. But what's interesting to me is how police itself is often a normalized idea. I think we often all think that we understand policing, and to the extent to where we don't need to actually really pause and think about what is police and what can we learn by thinking of policing as a specific logic of state power and how it operates in order to kind of think about what it demands of us and how then we can maybe better fight back. So, you know, and you brought up, Alex, how, you know, for years prison abolition was, you know, what was the primary way in which we thought about abolition, and it is striking how little police kind of occupied people's imaginations. It was the prison. It was prison. I think now, obviously, we're kind of living in a police moment, but the real question is, you know, has there ever really been a history, at least under capitalist order, where that's not a police moment, because capital kind of requires a police presence, a police mandate. So I would just say, when we think about policing, I like doing this. This is something I often do, and one thing would be, I think it's interesting that if you just simply ask people what is policing, actually that very simple question all of a sudden becomes quite difficult to do. People fall back on things like social control, but I think we need to be very specific when we're thinking about it. So what I would say, and one of the things that I often do, is think about the police word. It's often never broken down etymologically looking at it, but I think we can learn a lot from the word itself. Police, the P-O-L, is kind of key to understanding the extent to which policing is synonymous with order. And I think this is what makes it so hard for people to think about abolition, and I think it opens up those reformist kind of co-optations, is that policing is linked to the very fundamental idea of political order, police and politics, but also policy. That there's longer histories. We all probably in the room know the histories of policing, from the slave patrol to European policing, 1829, this and that. But there's longer histories of police power. Policing prior to the early mid-1800s was really meant state policy broadly. It was a police power. This is why the courts often talked about the police power. And so I think it's useful to think about policing as a specific mode of power that develops with the collapse of feudalism and the rise of kind of racial capitalism. But policing is something that gets at the very heart of order. Like the idea that we can imagine order without policing is actually very, very difficult. And one way to look at this is the word civilization and police, as Mark Neocolis has pointed out, was at once synonymous. I mean, if you would have actually said civilization, it actually meant police, right? The police is kind of the key to civilization. And I think one way we can track this contemporary is through this idea of like the thin blue line. And I think it's easy to dismiss this as just sensational, colorblind racism of the police, and I think that's obviously there. But the thin blue line is a logic that actually, it's kind of like a police conception of history. The thin blue line's actually saying, from the police perspective, there is no such thing as civilization, or there is no order without police, right? And I think that's what makes this so difficult to kind of to fight, and how reform can kind of link up to that. That it's the police are not necessarily just patrolling a thin blue line; they are the thin blue line. Meaning there is no civilized, so to speak, form without this kind of presence of police as being able to make everything else possible, right? And I think that's. It really talks about, or I think it really shows the kind of seductive nature of the police for so many people, that we can't have all of these other things without first this police, a certain police conception of security, that security here means something very specific to policing. That policing is kind of the first and really the last line of defense for kind of civilized order to take place. And I think this it's worthwhile to think about that. And then I think, and the last thing I'll say is just thinking about the relationship between police and law. And one reason why I think it's really important for us to think specifically about policing is because if we don't have really clear definitions and understandings of the very power that we're fighting, we can often language can come in then and co-opt more radical kind of sensibilities. So policing and law, for instance, is often conflated, right? They're one and the same, and so you hear things like law enforcement when we know, empirically speaking, something Alex points out in his book, police do very little actual enforcing of the law, right? I mean, that's an empirical fact. But we often then get this overlap between thinking that the police is law, or that if there is a distinction, the law is, we appeal to the law in order to kind of hold police accountable, right? But if we think about policing as a kind of a prerogative power, it's an executive power, which we often don't, or I should say liberal conception of policing usually wants to identify police as part of the legal process, right? It's a legal process, and therefore, when police do things that are bad, we often will turn to the law in order to kind of hold the police accountable or to reprimand them. But I think one way to think about that, though, is if we conceptualize policing as an executive power that was never actually meant to be held accountable to law, to me, the only thing then that it offers us is kind of an abolitionist perspective of that view, because it's actually saying, right, if policing is an executive power, then you have to ask what actually holds the executive accountable, right? And the executive always kind of holds this prerogative emergency power to exceed kind of the constraints of law. I think this is the normal state of affairs of policing. I mean, this is the basic routine structure of policing. It's a prerogative power that was never meant. The law can't compel us to do the things, right, that the law tells us not to do. But that's what the police. That's why the state has the police, in order to intervene in those things, usually under the guise of security. So I think as much as we have books on policing, and we've been on the ground fighting policing for all these years, I think it is important to pause and think about policing itself as a very kind of specific mode of power that is a certain kind of resource for the state in order to kind of take care of all the things that the state wants to take care of, or to manage the everyday, and it's kind of the racialized order of things through this police power. And that's why I don't think police power, this is one of the things I often say, is a sideshow. It's actually fundamental to the very operation of political power and social order, right? That it's part of the very fabric of it. It's not, and I think this is where you see this in books often, where it's on all the problems of policing, but maybe sometimes never really defining policing. The book tends to be on other things, right? Or our conversations tend to be on other things, and policing is just kind of this. One example would be gentrification. Can we actually think of gentrification really happening without some? Policing is right? You can't build the order or a gentrified order or a space without having a police presence. Policing is not then, say, a sideshow to gentrification. It's our theories and our critiques and our challenges to gentrification have to have a very robust kind of rigorous understanding of policing, because you can't have gentrification without policing, and that's why I think we need very kind of specific. I think we need to and I think that's the beauty of the moment. I think is that policing is now coming under a much more kind of rigorous scrutiny that I think's long overdue. So.
Thank you to everyone for coming. I'd like to continue this line of thinking about what it is that the police connotes, what it means, what the language around all of that is. But to pick off the last thing you said, I mean, absolutely a phenomenon that I think has become alarmingly common in New York is that when there are these instances of yet another black person of color being killed by the NYPD, it's not at all unusual that the people who called the police would have been a white gentrifier, someone who came from the outside, who knows nothing about the community, who sees this person that they consider to be a threat, and then calls the agents of state violence to protect them. And I think there's a terrifying way in which saying police violence, saying police brutality is almost redundant, because ultimately they are agents of state violence. So what else but brutality and violence would be the things that they perpetuate? And I think it's also important to think of the fact that there is a slipperiness between police and whiteness, because yes, you can extract the thing that is the police from its historical context, but ultimately it's always protected profit, it's always protected capital, it's always protected the elite, and that means that it's always protected whiteness. And I personally think that we're leaving out a very important part of the equation if we don't talk about this. And in race studies, the sort of terra incognita, the thing that is never spoken about, is whiteness. That's the thing that gets the absolution of no introspection, of no questioning, in the same way that the police does when we allow them to be this authority to whom we are beholden, but not because they're actually doing any good for us, but because we think that we have no other options. And they are very much a corrective to the fact that the state cannot control people who it is not serving. No one needs to be policed. People need fair wages. People need health care. People need their art institutions to not be starved. No one actually needs to be surveilled. And I want to pull out a few, because my abolitionist perspective is informed from a socialist, Marxist one. And for example, if we take everything that happened in Ferguson, if we take even just the imagery of what was happening, part of what was so harrowing was that we were seeing the police for what they are, which is a militarized force. And something we can't ignore there is the fact that there was complicity between the Ferguson police, or just the American police forces in general, and the Israeli police. I mean, that is a military who was training police who are coming into communities, who are interfacing with civilians. And I mean, there's no hope. I mean, I certainly don't stand a chance towards an armed military person. Another thing which comes up within a socialist framework is this, I think, very false idea that because they have unions, the police are workers. They're not. The fact that you have a union does not make you a worker. At the end of the day, I mean, if we take socialism for what it is, which is a path towards communism, which in its most fundamental form is a state in which, and I'm sure all of you know this, the workers will be in charge of the means of production. Anyone who is a worker needs to be on that side of the fight. You can't be on the other one and also call yourself a worker. You need to be foregrounding racial justice. You can't be part of the institutions that are upholding racial oppression. And I also think that, and I think, Alex, you were alluding to this, that while an enormous portion of the fight is abolition, is the dismantling, we can't forget that we can't just sort of raise the ground and burn everything down and then we'll be okay. We do need to build in that void. And while I certainly think that we need to be uncompromising in our demands that the police need to be abolished yesterday, we also have to make sure that we don't foreground that so much that we forget that part of the work of getting rid of the police is to make them obsolete. So it's to give attention, to give funds, to give organizing energy towards building up the restorative justice systems that would replace the stridently punitive part of policing, but more than that, actually correcting the social ills which they've come to stand in as some sort of solution. And that's all I have to say.
Peace. Can y'all hear me? Okay. I was told to speak directly. Okay. So shouts to everything that's been said thus far, and to Verso and to Anne for the invite. I'm going to just try and go in the order of what I heard, not order in the sense of the, that, not that kind of order, but so for one, definitely this question of the grassroots organizing, that you spoke to. This seems to me central to the question of abolishing the police state. So I guess I'll just start. Personally, I work with organizations that are abolitionist in orientation. For example, the Campaign to Bring Mumia Home, also IWOC NYC, Incarcerated Workers Organizing Committee. And what I find is, as someone who has essentially never liked the police that I can recall in my life, or have always, been suspicious at the very least of, how they operate. It wasn't until I was in organizing spaces, particularly oriented toward that kind of work, that I felt that I was able to see that work actually have an effect, have an impact, on a broader scale than, yes, certainly. I'm not sure what's good with the questions of language use, et cetera, but fuck the police, certainly, but in isolation, that's one thing, and with organizational purpose behind it, that can mean something different. That can mean the difference between being kind of isolated and, at a demonstration, for example, and, beaten up and quickly arrested or what have you, versus, being able to demonstrate what organizing power, so to speak, or however you want to put it, that kind of organizational strength can represent, which is meaningful to people. I know that when I've seen that kind of effort put in place and be effective, that's made a difference for me. So grassroots efforts are, certainly critical and essential to this entire conversation. And then I also heard about the pitfalls of reform. Another, this is utterly critical because the reform narrative is one that goes back decades and, however far back the word reform goes. I'm not familiar with the etymology of that word per se, but reform, pretty simply put, we're going to reformulate, we're going to just shift some things around and make sure that this stays in place as we would need it to or like it to or what have you. So a reformed version of the police state, to me, just sounds, that's the exact opposite of what we need at this point. That's what's been occurring and will continue to occur so long as we are, complacent on that question, of reforms. Now, some reform measures were mentioned. We could talk about, so to speak, radical reforms and the like, and these are worth at least discussing, because I know for sure I've been in scenarios where, for example, y'all may be familiar with the concept of not community policing, because this was a very trying discussion, within this larger discussion to have. Not community policing, but community control, this conversation, right? And it goes back, to the 60s, probably, beyond that. But, these are the kinds of radical reform measures that are at least worth our conversation and our efforts to see where that dividing line really is. You know what I'm saying? Because y'all may be aware that there were efforts in recent history in this city to push community control over the police, community control over schools, community control over health, et cetera, housing. So if we're talking about situating the people in a position to take power and to take control over these institutions that we know are essentially oppositional to us and to our power and sovereignty, et cetera, however you want to put it. Speaking of language, I know that's like that's a kind of dicey term to use, but if we're talking about control, these are at least radical reform conversations worth having. And I've definitely engaged in these conversations and, to mixed responses. But it seems like, broadly speaking, people are open to that kind of concept. Let's not talk about civilian, complaint review boards some more, because like we've been in that place for quite a while now. And even the most radical complaint review boards, as we know, have been facing, the pushback that comes with that. Okay, you've exhausted your energy getting this radical review board, and so now what? Now that you've put yourself in this position, well, let's legislate this, legislate that. What are you going to do now? I mean, it is a very difficult kind of place to see as like an end goal of this kind of conversation. So totally in agreement with this question of reform as essentially a curse word. I mean, if we're going to talk about reform, we should have very clear and strong arguments as to why we're talking about reform. Is this some sort of strategic, allowance of reform to crop into our discussion about abolition, recognizing what the long-term aim is, the midterm aim, what that is. So moving on to other discussions that, other comments that I heard from the panel, this question of the police and the origins of the concept of the police and the notion of order and, civilization, et cetera. I mean, so we're all clear at this point. I mean, most of the lawlessness that occurs, within this, construction, on this landmass, within this, society, however we want to define it, seems to be coming from those very police that are supposedly upholding law and order. I mean, y'all may, for example, have heard about the so-called Golden State Killer, right? The Golden State Killer, and we're talking about mass rape, serial murder, right, under the color of law, right? So, I mean, who's in the position to do the most crime, to enact the most criminality, the most lawlessness? We've seen pretty recently in the city, NYPD officers found to be engaging in rape, a little bit further back if we look, and an officer of the NYPD engaging in child abuse, child molestation, and videotaping this or convincing small children's parents to engage in this kind of practice. And we don't necessarily hear about this all day, every day, the way that we would, no doubt, if, for example, an NYPD officer were harmed tonight, this would be on loop for the rest of the week, most likely, right? But these acts of lawlessness on the part of these, so-called law enforcement officials are given pass after pass after pass after pass. So it seems to me that it's not even really a question of law, order, or crime. I mean, it's a question, as has been spoken of power, authority, order, the thin blue line. I mean, we're looking right now at legislation being passed, bills around the so-called Blue Lives Matter. I mean, what is a blue life? And it's an absurdity because, like, we're still questioning whether, like, okay, if you speak the phrase, if you utter Black Lives Matter, you are immediately, oftentimes met with all sorts of complaints, arguments, this is not inclusive, etc. But I mean, so it literally, you see individuals like in court, representing for, we were out supporting Mumia's legal case, relatively recently, a couple months back, and there are supporters of these law enforcement officials, slave patrollers, whatever term you want to use for them, wearing their Blue Lives Matter T-shirts, etc. And, so, I mean, blue is apparently an acknowledged class, a class with political rights, and the like, but, black, and, so it goes back. It goes back a great deal. Y'all touched on the question of slave patrols, the origins of policing. This is part of what we're here to discuss. As far as all of that is concerned, if we're really going into the origins and discussions around why it is that to this day, with impunity, these individuals, these characters can just murder us in broad daylight, try and frame us in broad daylight on video, etc., and feel emboldened to do that, it's because, this foundationally, where it is, what we are up under, comes out of a slaveocracy that is maintained to this day, under the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment has an exception clause. But the 13th Amendment has an exception clause that allows for the enslavement of human beings, continued 1865 and on to today, behind that exception clause. So, I mean, also to continue from what has been brought up in the panel, the question of capitalism, socialism, what are the capitalist roots of these United States, how can we talk about capitalism and the United States and not talk about slavery, right, and the slave trade, So if we recognize that the 13th Amendment allows for the enslavement of human beings, we do have to, I certainly hear what you're saying about not over-determining the question of the prisons and jail. Police are the first line, the thin blue line, that leads to prison slavery, but we also cannot disconnect that from the question of where do you end up if you're caught by one of these modern-day slave patrollers. You end up, you're maybe one of the over 10 million, 11, perhaps 12 million, who are held in jails out here, you're one of the well over 2 million imprisoned, under prison slavery. And at that point, anything goes, So if you recognize that you wield that kind of threat behind you, then you feel emboldened to do just about anything. And we're seeing that, all day, every day out here.
Great.
So we wanted to just open up for discussion, but to make it,
Yeah.
but to make it a broader discussion, not just among the panelists. So if there's questions, comments, please put your hand up. Well, I don't know what time we're going to go to, Anne, but we'll take as many as we can and try to create a discussion around those questions. There's one in the back.
Hi, thank you so much. My question is about, what do we do tomorrow to create this abolitionist vision? And a lot of the things that you said are about language. But I also am interested in campaigns that you see are doing the work of shifting that narrative. The organization I work for was part of the Urban Shield campaign, which was a win, which is really great, and is part of No Cop Academy. And I just wonder what the examples are of the deepest level of campaigning that does the work of laying the way for abolitionist future.
Well, I'll talk about a few here in New York. There's a bill in the state legislature to legalize marijuana. There's all this back and forth about should we arrest them, should we give them a ticket? This is all bullshit, right? The police should have nothing to do with marijuana. It should be legalized. So I argue that's police reform, legalizing marijuana. The Urban Youth Collaborative has been running a campaign to get the NYPD out of schools. They're doing that work day in, day out. The Rockaway Youth Task Force and Make the Road by Walking and the Red Hook Initiative, these are groups on the ground doing this work, working with young people. TAG and I are part of a large sort of coalition of groups that are working to stop gang suppression policing, to put our energies into community-based anti-violence initiatives instead. We're going to have city council hearings on June 11th, press conferences, a rally at City Hall. I mean, there is plenty to plug into. And in my book, in every chapter, I talk concretely about the organizing that's going on across the country, provide examples internationally of what this would look like.
First of all, thanks, y'all. That was an amazing panel. So I'm a teacher in a transfer high school on the Upper West Side, so a lot of kids who get kicked out of other high schools, and we're kind of their last stop. And there are a ton of conversations around restorative justice, and it's like really effing difficult to move people within the schools. People who acknowledge that the system isn't working, but the only stopgap they know is disposability and violence. And I guess it brings to me the question, you know, violence really is like the engine of capitalism, right? Like there aren't property rights without violence. There aren't land exclusion and genocides without violence. So it's kind of the core. But like a lot of y'all have said, like we're all, I forget who said it, but like we're all enlisted in policing, and by the language of cops, and I think by that faith in violence. And I guess I just want to ask y'all, I mean, you kind of spoke to this before about the campaigns, but how do we build a solidarity that scrambles people's faith in violence and reorients it towards a faith in a different kind of human relations? Because I think that's just so key and so deeply embedded in folks. And shit, man, it's really tough to figure out how to deal with it.
So I have a chapter on school policing in the book, and but you're kind of asking a bigger question. First, I want to say that the use of violence isn't unique to capitalism. And what I try to talk about is really regimes of exploitation. Slavery, colonialism, neoliberal restructuring, austerity. These are, and we can think further back about mercantilism and, you know, when the first slaughtering of the indigenous population took place 500 years ago, it wasn't a system of capitalism, right? But it was state violence in the pursuit of wealth, and backed up by, you know, incredible levels of violence. So I think, though, that this speaks to the bigger issue, right? We have to articulate an idea about justice that isn't equated with punishment, because we've fallen into this dynamic, and capitalism, and especially the neoliberal arrangements we have today, require that we define crime and social problems as the result of individual and group moral failure that will only respond to punitive sanctions, and we have to blow that whole mindset out of the water. And that's what I try to do in every chapter, is I say there is a different way to approach this problem that doesn't require this punitive turn that dominates our thinking, that our criminal justice system has become a giant revenge factory. So we have to articulate a new meaning of justice. It's about empowering individuals, building up communities. You know, the problem in the schools, and unfortunately, you know, the UFT is part of the problem here, as I'm very well aware, is that the mindset is we have to sacrifice 20 or 30% of the kids to save 70 or 80% of the kids. Well, the United Federation of Teachers, which is the local that represents New York City public school teachers. They're part of the American Federation of Teachers. And I'm in an allied local So I deal with them regularly because at CUNY we're unionized and we're also part of the AFT. So they have given up on the possibility of a non-punitive theory of justice. And we've got to articulate constantly the value of the lives of even the kids who are disruptive, and that we have an obligation not to just X them out.
I do just want to push back quickly. I don't think we should stay on this point and quibble, but as far as I'm concerned, any exploitative regime has been a capitalist one. But I do want to strongly emphasize what you said about changing our conception of justice. And I think that falls in line with just this much larger way of thinking where what has been responded to in the past few years are these sort of spectacularized instances of violence. And I don't mean to say that those aren't extremely important, but that we do tend to forget the mundane, everyday violence that people are subject to, that especially Black people are subject to in this country. And I think it's that we need to change our approach to where we literally care about people in the everyday instance of their lives, and not just when something has gone terribly awry. And I think that does emphasize the importance of upholding things as fundamental as housing and healthcare, because I mean, if we all agree that violence is not just these random brutal impulses that are coming from people, but are a response to conditions which are literally untenable and unlivable, I think that sometimes, unfortunately, there isn't really a direct way into the problem. It's that you have to start addressing the laundry list of social ills that are creating that situation.
Yeah, I mean, I just tend to agree. I mean, you spoke to much of what I would say. I would say that there's an implied violence to the way that this society has been constructed out here that needs to be addressed, and especially on the question of education, So pardon the plug, but like the campaign to bring Mumia home, of which I am a part, it has recently started a political education around the book Loaded by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. And this is violence in the extreme, and it speaks to the very origins of this particular product called the United States, where violence is at the very core and constantly being perpetuated at every moment throughout the history to bring us here, right? To bring us to this place. And so a sober, clear look at that reality in some ways is a counter-violence of sorts, coming to terms with the violence that allowed for this formation to come to exist. That requires a certain level of humility, a certain level of perhaps, recognition of the need for purposeful approaches to existing within this formation, recognizing that simply existing here with all of the funding that we provide to all of the global violence that occurs every second out here that we are that we are basically shielded from a propaganda standpoint, recognition of that is a kind of counter-violence, anti-violence type of approach.
Hi. So that actually connects really well to the question that I wanted to ask, which was, I really appreciate the everyone's kind of real attention to the particularities of policing and police violence. But I was wondering if people could expand a little bit on something that Yasmina started to bring up and that was just coming up a little bit now, which is the connections between military state power and police state power. And so that's sort of both in terms of the kind of direct material connections that we see in places like Ferguson and Standing Rock and other places, but also the sort of political connections and the ways that language of war can actually facilitate intensified policing of domestic populations at home?
You guys write about that.
Yeah, we have a few entries to get at this, and I think, police militarization was, has been among it's like the cause célèbre of, like ACLU, for example, or Cato Institute people, like Radley Balco. And, our take in the book is really, there really is no difference between police and the military, and there never has. I mean, the New York Police Department, when they were formed, their first uniforms were the uniforms of the Northern Army after the Civil War. There's also this idea that often that there's a sort of one-way relationship, that the military is somehow influencing what is otherwise this sort of like democratic or possibly democratic policing going on in the United States, and where there's examples of that we use that are real and have real meaningful impacts, like the transfer of military weaponry into police departments, and we should confront that. But it isn't a one-way. First of all, it's not anything really very new. It's not a one-way relationship. The Albuquerque Police Department trains military personnel. We try to point out throughout the book that much of what police do shares a lot in common with the military, right? I mean, community policing is a form of counterinsurgency. Community policing is a form of pacification. Midnight basketball with like kids is the same as like having tea with tribal elders. It's the same sort of logic. So there's a shared logic, there's shared tools and materials, shared training, shared personnel, of course. They move back and forth, right? The same people that were torturing prisoners in Guantanamo Bay were working for the police in Chicago. So there's, and so, I think our approach to it in the book, and I'll let Tyler speak to this more specifically, was to sort of, was to suggest we should, this is in some ways it's a trap. It's like a police reform trap. Because what do we win if we confront police militarization? First of all, how do we measure that win? But let's imagine in some way that we demilitarize police. I mean, it wasn't the jackbooted thug that killed Tamir Rice, right? It wasn't the sort of militarized SWAT officer that hauled Sandra Bland out of her car. We get what we get, and it's the same police that are engaging in the practices of policing that we're talking about confronting here. So there's a few entries that get at that in the book, but I don't know if you wanted to add anything, Tyler.
No, I think you're right in pointing out. I think it's important. Police and military are growing out of colonial histories, but I think what David's saying that I think is important is that how, and it relates to the conversation that we've had up here about reform, how the discourse of militarization often presents a certain solution to policing, right? The community policer or the officer friendly, or the demilitarized cop, and to that. I don't think you can ever do that because war is built into the police project. It's not, something that, and I think that's kind of what the militarization language often does, is it kind of implies that there's kind of a military corruption of a relatively noble police force, right? And I think this is why the militarization discourse becomes so powerful, and particularly, it is interesting that liberals use this a lot, but also libertarians use this a lot too. Like, they're kind of in agreement, and they use that same language of militarization. And I think that's a problem. So I think we need to put war at the center of policing and colonial history into policing. But I think we can do that without necessarily resorting to at least some of the worst versions of kind of militarization language, because I think it, I always joke, that, even if you take the military out of the police, you're still left with the police. And, that means you're still left with war, or you're still left with a colonial kind of war logic. But I am interested in how militarization has become like the way to reform the police. Let's demilitarize the police. And I think that's kind of a sneaky discourse in order to prop up the good cop project. And David is right. Community policing itself. What's also interesting about militarization specifically is what's counted as militarization and what's not counted as militarization, and it's kind of absurd, right? So I mean, I'm doing a long project, a book project on the racial political history of the police dog, but it's really interesting. Like the police dog's never talked about as a like a militarized technology. It's just like it's the police dog, you know. But it's like that doesn't get grasped, but the SWAT officer does, or maybe some new military technology that, you know, that's identified as militarization. So even then it kind of breaks down. So like community policing, as David said, it comes out, I mean, it's very much coming out of the pacification strategies of Vietnam. So it's like, you know, so, and that community policing historically has been one of the paradigms of policing that liberals have kind of proposed as the solution to militarized policing, rarely pointing out the fact that they both developed, the more contemporary militarized force today developed alongside the rise of community policing, right? They're kind of connected, the iron fist and the velvet glove kind of framework.
I don't disagree with any of that. There's a slightly different framing that I use to talk about the analytic distinction in relationship to statecraft, which is that when we think about colonialism, we generally, what we're talking about is at first a military adventure of conquest. But those military adventures are both expensive and illegitimate and inefficient in managing long-term occupation. And so what you see typically is the replacement of combat troops with some form of policing. And the distinction here is that policing is focused on efficiency and legitimacy. So they will, for instance, often hire people from the location that is being controlled to be line police officers under the command of the foreign colonial power. They will be less brutal, less militarized. They will try to handle things with handcuffs instead of rifles. They will embed themselves into communities, gather intelligence, and therefore be able to act preemptively rather than just lining up and shooting at people. And basically, this is also why we got the rise of policing in Europe and in the northern United States, is that we got tired of using the militia that was ineffective, inefficient, and illegitimate, and policing was a way to manage labor unrest in ways that was more legitimate and more cost-effective. So it's functionally the same, but in terms of statecraft, it does things in a different way. And so the fact that policing has become so militarized is interesting, but obviously the return to demilitarized policing and things like community policing is exactly the trajectory that we would expect to see in an attempt to restore legitimacy.
Hi, first I'd like to say thank you to all the panelists and also the organizers. I think so far a lot of you have talked about like promoting this idea of police abolition as like the form of activism. Tyler, I think you said something about like the police as a part of the executive branch and how they're like not accountable to the law. And so I guess like I'm thinking like we as like small organizations, grassroots organizations, and as individuals trying to bring down this system, how do we attack, or I guess like a lot of what I've heard as like part of this work, part of this activism is like lobbying or, you know, like city council meetings and these types of things. So it's like, how do we, if they're not accountable to the law and if the law doesn't want this, like what is it that we're reaching for? And then also, Yasmina, you said something about like replacing the system that we have right now as part of like the activism in abolition, in abolishing it. And I was wondering like what you've learned, or like anybody on the panel can answer, like what kind of other like rehabilitation type of systems and such you have learned about.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so my comment about, it's not so much that they belong to the executive branch, but I think legally, or the way in which they're embedded within the state power is as kind of an executive power. And so, I mean, I don't have necessarily an answer to the question. I'm posing that because I think that it offers us, to me, then the only thing that really comes out is kind of an abolitionist framework of that. Because the real question is kind of, one way that things have been oriented is, how can we make the police accountable? But if you start from the assumption that the police were never meant to be accountable, like that's why capitalist states have a police power, then it actually presents the very, the question that you're asking, right? Was then how do we do this? And I don't know. And I'll just use this as a moment to point out something that I like, that I think really gets at the relationship between police and law and emergency and executive. But the U.S. courts have refused. Marcus Dubber in his book called "The Police Power" on Patriarchy and the Foundations of American Government, I think. But he really makes a great deal out of this, tracking the legal history of police power. But the U.S. courts, they have refused to define discretion. I mean, they actually refuse to define it. And his point, and this is kind of his language, but the reason, and they've basically been pretty clear on this, is to define it is to limit it, right? And so if you define police discretion, then you're automatically drawing a certain bound around what police can actually do. And in fact, the courts have actually said the police can basically do whatever the hell they want. And so I only say that as to kind of, I guess, just repeat your question. I mean, that's, I think, a question that we have to really think about. If we start from the assumption that police were never meant to be accountable, they're the armed force to be able to get shit done for the state and to manage threats. I think we have to start from that assumption, and then, but the grassroots question, yeah, I mean, and it even gets to Tag's point about community control. I mean, can that ever really be attainable if the police retains its form, right? I don't know.
Yeah, I wanted to actually say something about that, which was that I have two concerns about community control of the police, which I actually criticize this idea in the book. One is that what we risk is unleashing racialized parochialism, which is this community has its idea of what policing is, and that's about excluding anyone who doesn't look like them, and then this community has another idea about what, and that just leads to, balkanization, and since whites are in the majority, their control of their police is going to look really terrible for everyone else. But the bigger question, as Tyler was suggesting, is just that better control of an apparatus whose fundamental nature and purpose is repression does not sound like a strategy for liberation to me. What I want is more community power, more community control over actually building up the positive resources of the community. So I don't want to put political energy into community control of the police any more than I do another oversight body, any more than I want to put it into just like putting a few cops in jail. I want to build community power around a vision of community liberation, and that doesn't involve police at all.
And for the latter part of your question, I have not taken part in any sort of restorative justice program. I've heard some firsthand accounts, read about how it works. But I think basically the fundamental idea would be that the people to whom you're accountable is your community. So the people who know you, who know an individual who's committed perhaps a heinous act still in the fullness of their being and not as this aberration who's done something violent and horrible. Because, I mean, even when we're thinking of this, the sort of individualizing good cop argument for someone who is against abolition, an individual instance is nothing in the face of a system which is fundamentally unfair. And if the way that you approach the situation where someone has done something awful to another person, like the idea would be that comes from their community, not just because that's the right thing, but because it can only come from their community, that a measure which is restorative can only come from that context. It simply by its nature cannot come top down. And that it would literally have to be a group effort. The onus is on everyone, and everyone has to be accountable to that. Because, I mean, I sometimes think if you took a random pool of people, and there was, say, an NYPD officer in that pool of people, but you strip them of whatever their title profession is and just took a little list of certain defining characteristics of everyone in that room, why on earth would you ask the person who is the most likely to be racist, sexist, transphobic, homophobic to come to a solution about a problem? So yeah, it would have to be a communist community endeavor.
Hi. Thank you, everyone, first of all. I know that it's very convenient to talk about racialized policing and this sort of white cop, black victim narrative, but there's been a lot of great historical writing and scholarship around black police, and, you know, like policing our own is one example. And there's a long history of, you know, black police only being allowed to police black communities and things like that. And the history of the integrated police force is rather new. And I'm just wondering what is effective, because in my community, you know, I've been working on very small incremental issues, but I'm ultimately working in the black radical tradition, and I'm interested in precipitating crisis in my community. And I'm wondering what's effective in terms of having people confront their complicity, because there's a historical, especially in New York, there's a history of our communities asking for police to come in, asking for ramped up policing. So how do we confront that within our own communities? What have you seen that's been effective? Because I feel like I live in Crown Heights, and our community next to us has their own community police force that I guess cooperates ultimately with NYPD, but there is something to that, and we do look to that. It's like, look, they can solve their own problems and we can't. So what's effective, and, you know, I guess what's not?
Greatly appreciating the question. And, well, a few things on that. First of all, I mean, we shouldn't be calling the police, you know? We really shouldn't. We shouldn't be calling the police, and we should figure out somebody else to call, you know, in instances of crisis. Because in my experience, my observation, what do? They ramp up the situation. They ramp up the violence. They make the conflict worse. This may not be so for everyone in this room or for everyone. You know, you spoke to a community nearby. You know, they have some sort of collaborative relationship with the police. But that's not something that I've experienced. And so, I mean, I think it in some ways brings us back to this question of community control, because, I mean, absolutely, and ideally I made this clear before, but like, I'm not about, you know, reform measures. However, I do recognize that, like, the kind of like revolutionary scenario that it seems that all of us on this panel, and I'm hearing a lot from like those of y'all who've asked questions as well, you know, are kind of looking toward as like a post-police state type of environment is not, you know, necessarily tomorrow. And so how do we curtail, you know, some of the violence, some of the death, some of the enslavement that's occurring in our communities right now, you know? So that's kind of what brought me toward that particular struggle. And I see it as just one aspect of the struggle. So like if certain communities that are, for example, and you speak to this in your book, you know, there's this phenomenon referred to as $1 million blocks, right? Blocks, you know, square blocks, wherein heads are being so hyper-policed, hyper-incarcerated, that they're drawing millions of dollars, per year from these like single blocks. That speaks to a total lack of control over the community. So how do you delimit those kinds of harms? It's really through building community wherever that comes from. So again, we're talking about grassroots organizing. It does not have to be around any particular, if you get community control over housing on your block, that is also a defense against policing, against incarceration, because as was mentioned, there's no separation between gentrification, racial displacement, and hyper-policing and incarceration. They're totally linked. So any semblance of control that you can get over your own community, whether that be just your building or your block or an organization or an entire community, brings us, one step closer toward, what it sounds like a lot of us are aiming toward out here.
I would say start by looking at James Foreman Jr.'s book, Locking Up Our Own, if you haven't looked at that yet. It's not perfect, obviously, but it speaks directly to some of these dynamics, and also, should disabuse everyone of the idea that hiring a few more black police officers is somehow going to be any kind of improvement, because there's absolutely no reason to think that. Let's think about Crown Heights for a second. So you have two communities, a black community, African American, Afro-Caribbean, and a largely white Jewish community, and some white gentrifiers. Now, the power of the white communities to be free from policing is not because they have the Shamrim, their own personal police force, it's because they have political power. And they use that political power to do exactly what I argue for, which is they demand of the state non-punitive solutions to their community problems. So that if they have a health crisis in their community, they get a clinic. If they have a drug abuse problem in their community, they get treatment services. If they want to have private schools with state funding, they get that. They're unified, they vote 100%, they're focused on local politics, and they're out organizing us. And so I don't think the solution is to reproduce the Shamrim in the black community. It's to get that kind of political power. Now, there are all kinds of structural reasons that work against the African American community getting that power. So it's not like they start from the same position. I understand that. But I just think that there's no shortcut to that. And I don't think we should get diverted all our energies into, jail some killer cops. Because that, to me, doesn't build the kinds of community power and community solutions that are going to really make lives better for people. Yeah.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks a bunch. This is a question about some currents on the socialist left that some would say cynically assert that an unashamedly abolitionist agenda would be a detriment to winning over quote-unquote regular people and building a mass working class movement. Obviously, there are some pretty suspicious implications about who these so-called regular people are. But to your minds as organizers, what's the best way for the organizer or activist to assuage this kind of apprehensiveness so we can actually move forward with this work? Because this is a cynical and destructive mindset, yet it's one that unfortunately does have real traction in some currents of the socialist left.
Man, I don't know. I don't want to talk to those people. I think if we are starting from the square one where the person does not even believe in abolition, I don't know what it is other than a question of political education, of sort of breaking it down, how and why they ultimately do not serve the well-being of that person as an individual, as a community. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I frankly just don't, and this is something that I have thought a lot about just because I personally cannot disarticulate my socialism, communism, Marxism from an abolitionist stance. So I don't know how they're going so wrong. But yeah, I think they need to be talked out of it. I think this is where it is good for people to come for their own. I think that at the end of the day, a white man in this country is not going to take me as seriously as he is going to take his fellow white man. And if we're thinking of the context of the left, if we're thinking of a group like DSA, of which I'm a part and of which I have a lot of criticisms because I am a part of it, which is largely white and suffers enormously because of, I mean, not as a, it's white by its own making, but you know what I mean, is that people need, I mean, I think it's kind of easy in the context of an organization because you're all there, you've all agreed to be there, you've all agreed to speak to each other. I think you need to meet people where they are, and sometimes a person will be the most responsive to someone whose position in the world most resembles theirs. So I think it's the responsibility of, those suspicious people, let's be real, they're white people. So other white people need to talk to them. And that's sort of where it begins.
I think there's also a tremendous skepticism about abolition in the African American community.
Oh, for sure.
So I just want to assert that. Look, you have to organizing is about communication. You have to understand your audience. You have to think about what your strategic objectives are, and it's going to be different in different circumstances. In this room, I'm talking a lot about abolition, theoretically, conceptually, strategically. I don't use the word abolition once in the book. The book is designed to speak to a much broader audience that may not be aware of the concept or may be disposed against it, but talks very concretely about lived experiences and about how to make progress on increasing human dignity, equality, et cetera, and that the ways in which policing interferes with that. And so that's the way I talk about it.
Yeah, I'd like to say a word on this too. As a white person who has tried to talk to other white people about the problem of police, it's tough. It's hard. And this book really comes out of that experience for me. I was trying to use the language of reform and smuggle into that language, skepticism about its possible success. To say, yes, you're right to want reform. Yes, we should do this. Yes, we should do that. Has it worked in the past? Well, that experience for me in organizing and writing, in popular outlets locally and trying to, and going to churches and talking to local church groups, or largely white churches in Albuquerque, was that, I think it's possible to accept that concern by some on the left at face value. I think it's worthwhile, in fact, saying, okay, how do we do it then? How might we talk to people who are skeptical of police abolition because they see police serves their interest? Well, how would you possibly convince somebody for whom policing as we know it serves their interest that we ought to abolish police? And so the question really should be, are you working in those communities? I mean, you're saying we should be cautious if we're talking about police abolition in those communities. And so are those concerns voiced by people who are actually trying to do it? Because for me, this book is that thing. It's like, okay, it's really hard to do this. And part of the problem I recognized was, I've been in a lot of rooms, and almost every room full of people talking about police ends up focusing really intently on what do we do about it? Give me some concrete steps. And invariably, unless it's like a city council meeting in which multiple different kinds of groups are coming together with competing interests, it's often a room of people with sort of like-minded interests or backgrounds, and there's gonna be this absolutely like I think in this room, we're like, yeah, this is the solution. There's this to do, we could do this, and then we should ask ourselves, well, why does this never happen? Why do we never get that? And I'm personally convinced that, and this is a very small part of the struggle, but I'm personally convinced every sort of rhetorical construction around police is a dead end that leads to more cops. Every time I have a conversation, we're tripping over the stones of familiar, like justified, armed, unarmed, pursuit, discretion, and I think that there is some value in saying, let's set aside for a second the fact that we know what would fix this. Let's set aside for a second, like we have these steps. We could say, let's do this. And ask instead, well, you know what? We're not the first one to come up with these ideas. The Panthers were talking about things very similar to everything we've talked about here today. Red power groups like AIM and others in the Southwest and in Minnesota and elsewhere were talking about the exact same things and doing similar things. So, what is it that we might try to do in that struggle to make it more effective, more powerful now? And I'm invested in this idea that maybe we should start talking about how, let's talk differently about cops. We need a different vocabulary. We don't, everything we think we know about police comes to us from police, so let's get rid of that language. Let's decolonize our minds of this language so that we can actually decolonize spaces that right now are occupied by police. And so that's, and listen, in Albuquerque, we have some very sectarian left groups, that are very difficult to work with. So I'm not at all pretending, that a sea of yellow signs, but but aren't really doing organizing. Aren't really talking. They're saying we should do this, but they don't actually do that thing, right? So I think I take seriously people who are doing the work in communities and have something to say about how to do that work in communities. Those are voices that are really much more important. Right?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. It seems like, fundamentally it's about, as has been mentioned, language, right? Communication. How do we communicate? Perhaps how do we communicate less directly to those who perhaps favor indirect communication, right? Which, is an intriguing and worthwhile question. This is part of what I appreciate so much about y'all's book, and this issue of a shared language, How do we attain a shared language around what we all recognize is a huge problem, for some, the biggest problem that we're facing? So shared language is extremely important. I would have to, not to be repetitive, bring it back to the question of prison slavery, the origins of the police, the origins of the kind of authority that the police feel that they wield. So if we're talking about abolitionism, from my perspective, we're talking about the abolition of slavery, which still exists in 2018 today in the United States. So it seems to me that that's perhaps a more popular concept to wrap one's mind around, and even superficially to connect with or to be identified with. If we're talking about individuals or, what have you, that perhaps feel uncomfortable with certain types of language or whatever, make them uncomfortable. So are you saying that you support slavery? You're not an abolitionist of slavery? What's wrong with saying that? So, I mean, and so from your book, you reference Haddon's work on the slave patrols, right? 2018, the NYPD, others, all of these police departments, they are the slave patrols of today. They are modern day slave patrols. You know, there's a great broadcast that I try to make sure not to miss ever, that weekly addresses this very question of prison slavery every week, called New Abolitionist Radio. You know, they are using the language of slave catchers, prison plantations, you know, what have you, popularizing this question of abolitionism, of slavery. You know, there is a rich history of abolitionists fighting against enslavement of human beings here, and it's still occurring. So if you look at those who are organizing on the inside, for example, August 21st is going to be another nationwide prison strike. You know what I'm saying? Heads are advocating for action for Juneteenth. You know, this kind of a misnomer of a holiday around the question of more, you know, confusion, the confusion that was engendered in enslaved Africans around whether or not, you know, emancipation had occurred. Well, it in fact didn't occur, and it still hasn't, you know. So this is the kind of popular history that could perhaps, you know, dissuade one, or at least put somebody in a position of discomfort, you know, to feel as though, well, no, I'm not going to attach myself to abolitionism. I'm not an abolitionist. I'm not some radical, right? Well, are you radical enough not to support slavery in 2018 of human beings? You know, that seems like it's a no-brainer, right? Clearly it's not, otherwise it would have been abolished. But, you know, at least from the standpoint of language, it can help put somebody in that corner. Are you an abolitionist or not?
Hello, I'd like to thank you all for being here today. This question is specifically for TAG. I was wondering, can you talk more about the campaign to bring Mumia home, and if y'all do any work outside of Mumia's case, and if so, what does it look like?
Yeah, absolutely. Greatly appreciate the question, because, yeah, the campaign to bring Mumia home right now is trying to do perhaps more than we should in some ways, because the fact is Mumia is in a very kind of distinctive position right now compared to decades of organizing around Mumia's case. You know, this is like a particularly exciting, frustrating, however, you know, all of these things moment, you know, as regards organizing around Mumia particularly, because there is a current opening in his case through the Terrence Williams case, which was tried in the Supreme Court. Essentially, Williams versus Pennsylvania opens up this question of, which should have been, it's incredible to think that this was not a problem, was not raised as a problem at the Supreme Court level until this moment. But basically, this brother Terrence Williams was prosecuted, convicted, and then had his appeals denied by the same individual who took part in that prosecution. The Supreme Court found recently in the past couple years that that is unconstitutional. You can't be the prosecutor and the judge, you know, in the same case. It's absurd. That's an obvious absurdity, but we're not talking about law. You know, this has been established. So, okay, so that brings Mumia, who, Ronald Castile, who was the DA at the time when he was convicted, then presided over his appeals as a judge. He is in the crosshairs right now behind that because he was, in fact, the judge as regards this Terrence Williams case, you know, in Pennsylvania. And, you know, and there's so much that could be said around that. Beyond that, August 30th will be the next hearing date behind that. That's been an ongoing legal saga to try and, you know, essentially prove that, yeah, like this is crazy. Ronald Castile did the same thing that he did to Terrence Williams. You know, all of this, complete misconduct, but that goes back decades, et cetera. Besides that, has our organizing right now around, I mentioned the political education, project that's going on in collaboration with, we're talking through the work by Dunbar Ortiz as it relates to Mumia's second to most recent book, because he just dropped a book, Murder Incorporated, but his second to most recent book called Have Black Lives Ever Mattered? And so we're, we put together a book party around that book a few months ago when that dropped, and so we're trying to, connect the questions of have Black Lives ever mattered? Why is it that Mumia would ask such a question? How do these questions of the Second Amendment and gun rights, et cetera, relate to questions of the worth of Black life, and the priorities of the state in the United States as it pertains to violence, guns, et cetera. And Murder Incorporated certainly, tackles those kinds of questions as well. There are, other things in the works behind the campaign to bring Mumia home, and anyone that would like to, discuss any of those, definitely feel free to, we can discuss it after this, or there's a website, you can email at bringmumiahome@gmail.com. But yeah, the August 30th and the next hearing behind this Williams case is the main focus right now around organizing around Mumia's case.
Okay, we don't have time for any more questions, but I wanted to thank Verso and everyone for coming out and the panel.